She smiled at the wedding planner. She smiled at the caterers. She smiled at every camera that would ever point at her face. But underneath the floor of a 200-acre estate in Connecticut, there was a tunnel nobody talked about anymore, and by midnight, she planned to make sure the maid who had seen too much would never speak again. Sophia Reyes had no idea that folding one stack of laundry on one ordinary Tuesday had already sealed her fate. And Victoria Hale had no idea that the man she was about to marry was standing in the dark behind her, watching every single move. Welcome back, friends. If this is your first time joining us, we tell real, raw, emotional stories about ordinary people caught in extraordinary moments, and tonight's story might be one of the most intense we've ever shared on this channel. Before we start, drop a comment and tell us, what country are you watching from tonight? Now get comfortable. Maybe grab something warm to drink, because once the story starts, you are not going to want to look away. The first thing you noticed about Sophia Reyes was that she never let a room feel empty. She was 28 years old, small and quick on her feet. With dark hair, she kept tied back in a loose braid so it wouldn't fall in her face while she worked. She had been at Greystone Manor for a little over a year, ever since she left Ohio with 2 suitcases, a bus ticket, and a promise to her mother that she would send money home every month for Mateo, her younger brother, who was 3 semesters away from finishing nursing school. Sophia kept that promise the way she kept every promise, quietly, without asking for anything in return. Greystone Manor sat on 200 acres of rolling Connecticut hillside, a stone estate built in the 1920s by a shipping magnate, later bought by the grandfather of Nathaniel Whitmore, the man who owned it now. Nathaniel was 34, the CEO of Whitmore Technologies, and by every account in every business magazine, one of the most private billionaires in the country. He rarely gave interviews. He rarely smiled for cameras. But the staff who worked inside his home knew a different man than the one the world saw, a man who remembered the names of everyone's children, who insisted the kitchen staff sit down and eat a real meal before 6 in the evening, who once drove 2 hours in the snow himself because a housekeeper's car broke down, and he didn't want her waiting for a tow truck alone in the dark. Sophia had seen that side of him more than once. It was one of the reasons she didn't mind the long hours. What she did mind, what she'd minded from the very first week, was Victoria Hale. Victoria was 30 years old, tall, polished, the kind of beautiful that seemed to have been assembled rather than simply grown. She had been engaged to Nathaniel for 8 months, and in that time she had redecorated 4 rooms of the manor, replaced 2 members of the household staff for reasons nobody quite understood, and developed a habit of speaking to the people who worked in that house as though they were part of the furniture. She never raised her voice. She never needed to. There was a coldness in the way she looked past people, through people, that Sophia had learned to recognize the way you learn to recognize the smell of rain before it falls. Sophia. Mrs. Dolores Kim, the head housekeeper, a stout woman in her 60s with sharp eyes and a soft heart, caught her in the hallway outside the East Wing that Tuesday morning. Miss Hale wants the guest study dusted and aired out before the engagement party planning meeting. And Sophia, don't touch the desk. She was very clear about that. I never touch anything on the desks, Sophia said, and she meant it. In a year of working in that house, she had learned exactly where the line was, and she never crossed it. But that Tuesday, the line crossed her. She was running the duster along the top shelf of the built-in bookcase in the guest study when a leather folder slid loose from between 2 hardcover books and landed open on the floor at her feet. She hadn't touched it. She hadn't even been near it. It had simply fallen, the way things do when a house is old and its shelves have settled unevenly over 100 years. Sophia bent down to pick it up, and that was when she saw the papers. She wasn't trying to read them. She told herself that later, over and over. She wasn't trying to read anything. But her eyes caught words the way eyes do, without permission. Hale Family Foundation. Whitmore Children's Fund. Consolidated Transfer. And beneath that, a list of numbers that made no sense to her at a glance, except for one thing. The account routing number at the bottom of 3 separate wire transfer confirmations was the same, and none of the 3 transfers had gone to anywhere associated with a children's charity. They had gone to something called Hale Capital Holdings, LLC. Sophia didn't know much about finance. She knew enough to balance her own bank account down to the last dollar because she had to. But she knew what a wire transfer looked like, and she knew what the words Whitmore Children's Fund meant, because she had heard Nathaniel talk about that foundation with more warmth in his voice than she had ever heard him use for anything else. It was the one thing he told the staff once at a holiday dinner that his grandfather had built and that Nathaniel was determined never to let fail: a scholarship fund for kids in foster care, kids who reminded him, he'd said quietly, of himself after his parents died. Sophia closed the folder. Her hands were not quite steady. "What are you doing in here?" Victoria's voice came from the doorway, sharp as a blade drawn from its sheath. Sophia turned, folder already back on the shelf, duster still in her other hand. "I'm sorry, Miss Hale. A folder fell when I was dusting the shelf. I was just putting it back." Victoria crossed the room in 4 unhurried steps and picked the folder up herself, running her thumb along its edge as though checking it for damage, or checking to see exactly how far it had fallen open. Her eyes, when they came back up to Sophia's face, were perfectly calm. That was the part that made Sophia's stomach turn cold. Not anger.
Calm.
"Did you read anything in there?"
"No, ma'am."
"I don't read anyone's private papers. I just picked it up off the floor." For a long moment, Victoria said nothing at all. She simply looked at Sophia the way a person looks at a math problem, working something out behind her eyes. Then she smiled, the same smile she gave the caterers, the same smile she gave the cameras, and it was somehow worse than if she had shouted. "Of course you didn't," Victoria said. "Finish the dusting. And Sophia, let's keep this between us. Nathaniel worries so much about the foundation, it would be a shame to bother him with something as silly as a folder falling off a shelf." She left the room without waiting for an answer. Sophia stood alone for a long moment, the duster hanging forgotten in her hand, her heart beating fast in a way that had nothing to do with the work she'd been doing. She told herself it was nothing. She told herself Victoria was simply a private person who didn't like her things touched, and that the numbers she'd seen probably had some ordinary explanation she wasn't smart enough to understand. She told herself all of this on her way down to the kitchen, and she almost believed it, right up until she found Mrs. Kim polishing silver at the long kitchen table and, without quite meaning to, told her what had happened. Mrs. Kim didn't say much. She kept polishing the same fork for a long time after Sophia finished talking. But her eyes had gone very still, the way they did when she was thinking something she didn't want to say out loud. "You did the right thing, closing that folder and walking away," Mrs. Kim finally said. "But Sophia, I want you to be careful around her. Not because you did anything wrong, because you didn't." Neither of them knew, that Tuesday afternoon, that Mrs. Kim would mention the strange folder, carefully, almost in passing, to Preston Aldridge, the family's longtime attorney, during his visit the following week. Neither of them knew that Preston would quietly begin pulling foundation records of his own. And neither of them knew that somewhere in that chain of small, careful words passed between people who were only trying to look out for each other, a single thread had been pulled, a thread that led directly back to Victoria Hale and to a discovery that would change all of their lives before the month was out. What would you have done if you'd found that folder? Would you have said something, or stayed quiet the way Sophia tried to? 3 weeks passed, and on the surface, nothing changed. Sophia kept working. She kept sending money home to Mateo. She kept setting the table for breakfast at 7 and turning down the beds at 9, moving through the enormous rooms of Greystone Manor like a small, quiet current through a still lake. If Victoria was watching her more closely now, Sophia told herself she was imagining it. If the household staff seemed to walk on eggshells whenever Victoria was in a room, Sophia told herself that had always been true. But it hadn't always been true, not like this. The first real sign came on a Thursday when Victoria accused the head gardener, a soft-spoken man named Frank Delgado, who had worked the grounds of Greystone Manor for 11 years, of trampling her new rose beds with his equipment. Frank hadn't touched the rose beds. Everyone knew it. But Victoria insisted, in front of Nathaniel, that Frank be given a formal warning, and Nathaniel, tired from 3 days of back-to-back board meetings, distracted by a merger that was eating every waking hour, had simply nodded and let it go rather than start an argument with his fiancée over rose bushes.
It was a small thing.
It shouldn't have mattered. But Sophia noticed it the way you notice the first crack in a dam. Small, almost nothing, and yet somehow you already know what it means. The second sign came 10 days later, and it was aimed directly at her. Nathaniel. Victoria's voice, honey smooth, floated from the study as Sophia passed in the hallway with an armful of fresh linens. I hate to bring this up, but I noticed my bracelet is missing. The sapphire one, from my mother. I had it on the dresser Tuesday night. Sophia stopped in the hallway, out of sight, her arms suddenly heavy with the weight of the linens. Have you asked the staff? Nathaniel's voice, lower, more tired than she'd ever heard it. I don't want to accuse anyone, but Sophia was the one cleaning our room that morning. Sophia's heart dropped straight through the floor. She had not touched Victoria's bracelet. She had not touched anything on that dresser except the vase of flowers she replaced every 3 days without fail. But she stood frozen in the hallway, linens pressed against her chest, waiting to hear what Nathaniel would say, because in that moment, she understood with total clarity that her job, her ability to send money home to Matteo, her entire life in this house, depended on what came out of his mouth next. Sophia's been with us over a year, Nathaniel said slowly. I've never once had a reason to doubt her. Have you checked the jewelry box? Sometimes things get moved around during cleaning. There was a pause. A long one. I suppose I could look again, Victoria said. The bracelet turned up that evening in the jewelry box, exactly where it should have been all along. Victoria apologized to no one. She simply mentioned, lightly, over dinner, that she'd found it, as though the entire incident had been a minor inconvenience rather than an attempt to have a 28-year-old woman fired, or worse, over nothing at all. Sophia understood, then, in a way she hadn't fully let herself understand before, that Victoria Hale was not simply cold. She was dangerous. And the folder in the guest study had not been forgotten. It had only been waiting. She's testing him, Mrs. Kim said quietly, the two of them alone in the kitchen late that night, the rest of the house long asleep. Testing how far she can push before he pushes back. And so far, Mija, he hasn't pushed back at all. Why would she want me gone that badly? Over a folder I didn't even read. Mrs. Kim was quiet for a moment, drawing a glass with more care than the glass required. Because you're the only person in this house who saw something she can't explain away. Firing you would have been easy.
Clean.
But it didn't work because Nathaniel actually trusts you. So now she has to think of something else. Sophia laughed, but there was no humor in it. What else could there possibly be? Neither of them had an answer for that. Neither of them wanted to imagine one. Frank Delgado found Sophia the next morning near the old stone cellar door on the west side of the property, half buried under decades of ivy, its iron hinges rusted orange. She'd wandered there on her morning break, drawn by nothing more than curiosity about a door she'd never seen used. Stay clear of that one, Frank said, appearing behind her with a wheelbarrow of mulch. That leads down to the old drainage tunnels. Manor had its own water system before the town ran the municipal sewer lines out this far, back in the 60s. Whole thing's been sealed off for years, unstable, they say. Old Mr. Whitmore, Nathaniel's grandfather, always said one day he'd have it filled in properly. Never got around to it. It just looks so forgotten, Sophia said. Forgotten's the safest thing a place like that can be, Frank said, and there was something almost like a warning in his voice, though neither of them understood yet how true that warning would become. 2 weeks later, Nathaniel called Sophia into his office. Not the guest study, his real office, the one lined with photographs of his grandfather and a single framed photo of his parents, taken the summer before the accident that took them both when Nathaniel was 22. I have to fly to Singapore for the merger, he said, rubbing a hand across his tired eyes. 10 days, maybe 12. Victoria's staying here to finish planning the engagement party. I know it's a big ask for the household with me gone, but I trust all of you to keep things running. He paused, and something in his face softened in a way Sophia had only seen him show a handful of times. Sophia, thank you for everything this past year. I know it hasn't always been easy around here lately. I see it. I want you to know I see it. It was the kindest thing anyone in that house had said to her in weeks, and it made the ache in her chest worse, not better, because some instinct she couldn't name told her that his absence was not going to make things easier. She was right. The night before Nathaniel's flight, Sophia passed the study and heard Victoria on the phone, her voice low, controlled, entirely unlike the honeyed tone she used for everyone else in the house. 10 days is enough time, Victoria was saying. Preston's already pulling records. I need this handled before he finds anything he can actually prove. And the girl needs to stop being a loose thread before she talks to someone who matters. Sophia didn't stay to hear more. She couldn't. She walked away on legs that didn't feel entirely like her own, her mind racing through a dozen explanations that all collapsed the moment she tried to make them make sense. The next morning, Nathaniel's car pulled away down the long gravel drive at 6 a.m., and Victoria stood on the front steps waving until it disappeared around the bend in the tree line. Then she turned around, and the smile fell off her face like a mask set down on a table. "The timing," she said softly, almost to herself, "is perfect." What would you have done in Sophia's place? Stayed silent, or found a way to warn someone before it was too late? The next 8 days passed in a strange, watchful quiet. Sophia told herself she was being paranoid. Victoria was polite to her, more polite than she had ever been, which somehow made it worse, not better. She asked Sophia to help with small details for the engagement party: table linens, flower arrangements, seating charts. She smiled at her in the hallways. And every single time she did, Sophia felt a cold drop low in her stomach that she couldn't explain and couldn't shake. On the 9th night, everything changed. It was past 10 o'clock, the rest of the household staff long gone home or asleep in the servants' quarters on the far side of the property, when Victoria found Sophia in the linen room folding towels for the morning. "I need your help with something," Victoria said, and her voice was warm, almost friendly, in a way that made the hair on the back of Sophia's neck rise before her mind had even caught up. "The decorations for the engagement party. The vintage lanterns, they're stored in the old cellar. I completely forgot until just now, and the florist needs to see them first thing tomorrow. Would you mind helping me carry them up?" "Of course, Miss Hale," Sophia said, because what else could she say? Because refusing a direct request from the woman who would soon be her employer's wife was not something a maid making rent money in a stranger's country could easily do. She followed Victoria out through the side door into the cold night air, across the dark lawn, toward the ivy-covered cellar door Frank had warned her about weeks before. "I didn't know this door still opened," Sophia said, watching Victoria produce a key from her coat pocket, the old iron hinges groaning as the door swung inward onto a set of stone steps descending into blackness. "It doesn't officially," Victoria said lightly, flicking on a flashlight. "Frank keeps meaning to have it resealed. Watch your step, it's uneven." They descended together, the beam of the flashlight throwing long shadows across walls slick with a century of damp stone. The air grew colder with every step, thick with the smell of earth and old water. Sophia's heart was beating very fast now, though she couldn't have said exactly why, only that every instinct she had was telling her, clearly and simply, that something was deeply wrong. At the bottom of the steps, the passage opened into what had once been a drainage tunnel, curved brick walls disappearing into darkness in both directions, a narrow channel of stagnant water running along the center of the floor. There were no lanterns. "Miss Hale, I don't see any decorations down here." "I know," Victoria said, and her voice had changed completely. The warmth gone, the mask finally, fully off. "There aren't any. I made that up." Sophia turned, and in the wavering flashlight beam, she saw something in Victoria's hand that made her blood run cold, a length of rope, coiled and ready, pulled from the pocket of her coat. "Miss Hale, please." "You should have just kept dusting," Victoria said, and there was no anger in her voice at all, which was somehow the most frightening thing about it. "You should have minded your own business. But you told Dolores about that folder, and Dolores told Preston, and now Preston is 3 signatures away from finding out that I've been moving money out of that precious little children's foundation for 2 years. Do you understand what happens to me if that comes out? Do you understand what I have built, what I am about to have, and that I am not going to let some maid from Ohio take it away from me?" I never told anyone anything that could hurt you. You told someone something, Victoria said, stepping closer, the flashlight beams swinging wildly across the tunnel walls. That was enough. What happened next happened fast. Faster than Sophia could think. Faster than she could scream before a hand clamped over her mouth. She fought, twisting hard against Victoria's grip. But Victoria was stronger than she looked, and desperate people find strength they didn't know they had. Sophia's shoulder struck the brick wall. The flashlight clattered to the tunnel floor, spinning, throwing crazed shadows across the curved ceiling. When it finally settled, its beam pointed sideways down the tunnel, and it was in that unsteady, sideways light that Sophia's wrists were bound, her back pressed against the cold brick, Victoria's calm, terrible voice telling her that this section of tunnel hadn't been inspected in 15 years, that no one would think to look for her here, that by the time anyone noticed she was missing, Victoria would already be married, and none of it would matter anymore. You won't get away with this, Sophia managed to say, her voice shaking but steady. Someone will know. No one will know, Victoria said. That's the whole point of a place like this. She turned to leave, flashlight in hand, already reaching for a heavy iron grate propped against the tunnel wall, one that Sophia realized, with rising horror, was meant to seal off this section of the passage entirely, sealing her inside it alone, in the dark, beneath 200 acres of ground that no one would think to search for weeks. And that was the exact moment a voice came out of the darkness at the far end of the tunnel, quiet, cold, and utterly unmistakable. Victoria. Step away from her. Right now. Victoria spun around, flashlight swinging wildly, and there, standing at the mouth of the tunnel where the passage curved back toward a second, older entrance near the garden shed, an entrance Victoria had never known existed, an entrance Nathaniel's grandfather had shown him as a boy, stood Nathaniel Whitmore. His merger meeting in Singapore had ended a day early. His flight had landed 6 hours ago. He had come home to surprise Victoria with the news in person, had let himself in through the old side gate to avoid waking the house, and had heard voices coming from beneath the earth just as he crossed the garden. Voices that led him, step by careful step, down through a tunnel entrance he hadn't used since he was 12 years old. He had been standing in the dark for almost 4 minutes. He had heard every single word. What do you think Victoria said when she realized the one person she thought she'd never have to answer to had been standing in the dark the entire time? For one endless second, nobody moved. Victoria's flashlight beam trembled in her hand, throwing wild shadows across the curved brick walls, across Sophia's bound wrists, across the iron grate still propped where Victoria had left it. Her mouth opened, and for the first time in 8 months of knowing her, Sophia watched Victoria hail search for words and find absolutely none. Nathaniel, she finally managed. This isn't. I can explain. Explain what exactly? Nathaniel's voice was low, and there was something in it Sophia had never heard before. Not anger, not yet, but something colder and more controlled, something that made the hair rise on her arms. Explain the foundation transfers Preston's been asking me about for a week. Explain why you have rope. Explain why Sophia is tied up in a sewer tunnel underneath my house. He was already moving as he spoke, crossing the tunnel in long, fast strides, dropping to his knees beside Sophia to work at the rope binding her wrists with hands that weren't quite steady. Sophia. Sophia, look at me. Are you hurt? Can you stand? I'm okay, she managed, though her voice was shaking badly now that the fear had somewhere to go. I'm okay, I promise. Victoria found her voice again, and it came out sharp, desperate, all pretense finally stripped away. You don't understand what you're throwing away. Everything I've built, everything we were going to have together. You were going to bury a woman alive in my grandfather's sewer tunnel. Nathaniel didn't look up from the rope, didn't give Victoria the satisfaction of his full attention. There is no version of what we were going to have together that survives this, Victoria. There never was one. If this is who you really are. She was going to ruin me. She didn't do anything except find a folder that fell off a shelf. The last of the rope came loose, and Nathaniel helped Sophia to her feet, one arm steady beneath her elbow, his eyes never leaving Victoria's face. You did this to yourself. Every part of it. Victoria's composure finally, completely broke. She lunged for the tunnel exit behind her. The original stairway, the one she'd led Sophia down 20 minutes before, but Nathaniel was already reaching for his phone, already dialing, his voice cutting through the tunnel's damp silence with a calm that was somehow more frightening than shouting would have been. "This is Nathaniel Whitmore, Greystone Manor, Old Ridge Road. I need police and an ambulance. There's been an assault, and I have a woman here who tried to physically restrain and confine my employee against her will." "Yes. Now, please." Victoria didn't make it up the stairs. Frank Delgado, who had come out to check on strange lights moving in the garden and had heard raised voices drifting up from the old cellar door, was already standing at the top of the steps when she reached them, blocking the only other way out with the simple, immovable presence of a man who had spent 11 years quietly loving this family and everyone who worked for it. "Going somewhere, Miss Hale," was all he said. The next 40 minutes passed in a blur Sophia would only fully remember in pieces, later, replaying it in her mind the way you replay a dream you're not sure was real. Police cars in the gravel drive, red and blue lights spilling across the front of the manor. Paramedics checking her wrists, her shoulder where it had struck the brick wall, asking her gentle questions she answered in a voice that didn't quite sound like her own. Victoria being led out of the house in handcuffs, past the same front steps where she'd waved goodbye to Nathaniel's car 9 days earlier, her face a mask of fury that no longer looked beautiful at all, only small and cold, and finally exposed for exactly what it had always been. Nathaniel didn't leave Sophia's side once. He sat beside her in the back of the ambulance for the ride to the hospital, even though the paramedics assured him repeatedly that her injuries were minor: bruised wrists, a bruised shoulder, the deep shaking exhaustion of terror finally allowed to let go. He sat in the hospital waiting room until 3 in the morning, drinking bad vending machine coffee, calling Mrs. Kim to update her, calling Preston Aldridge to confirm what the attorney had already begun to suspect on his own, that Victoria Hale had been quietly siphoning nearly $400,000 from the Whitmore Children's Fund over the past 2 years through a shell company registered in her own name. "I should have seen it," Nathaniel said quietly, sitting in a plastic hospital chair beside Sophia's bed sometime past 2 a.m., his voice rougher than she'd ever heard it. "I should have seen who she really was. Instead, I let her push everyone in that house around for months, and it almost got you killed." "You didn't know," Sophia said. "None of us really knew. Not until tonight. You knew something was wrong. You told Dolores. You tried." Trying isn't the same as being believed. He was quiet for a long moment, looking at his own hands. "I believe you now. I should have believed the version of this that mattered from the very beginning, that a person's true character shows in how they treat the people who can't do anything for them. I built a whole company on data and instinct, and I completely missed it in my own home." Sophia didn't have an answer for that. She was too tired, too raw, too far past the adrenaline crash to find the right words. But she reached out, carefully, and closed her bruised hand around his for just a moment. Not romantic, not yet, nothing so simple as that. Just two people who had both nearly lost something enormous that same night, holding on to the fact that they hadn't. Mateo called from Ohio at 6 the next morning, his voice cracking with fear and relief when Sophia finally answered and told him she was okay, that she was safe, that she would explain everything when she was ready. She didn't tell him all of it that morning. She wasn't ready to say the words sewer tunnel or rope or buried alive out loud yet, not even to the one person in the world who had known her longest. She would tell him everything, eventually. But first, there was a long road of healing ahead of her, and though she didn't fully understand it yet, standing at the very beginning of that road with her, step for step, was a man who had almost lost everything the same night she had. If you were Nathaniel in that moment, what would you have said to Sophia first? The trial took 4 months. Victoria Hale was charged with kidnapping, attempted murder, unlawful imprisonment, and financial fraud exceeding federal reporting thresholds. Preston Aldridge's records, combined with Nathaniel's testimony and Sophia's, along with Frank Delgado's account of what he'd witnessed at the top of those cellar stairs, left the jury very little room for doubt. Victoria was sentenced to 18 years, the maximum the state allowed for the combination of charges against her, and Sophia sat in the third row of that courtroom on sentencing day, not because she needed to see Victoria's face one final time, but because she needed to see, with her own eyes, that this particular chapter of her life was finally, completely closed. Greystone Manor changed in the months that followed, in ways both large and small. Nathaniel rebuilt the Whitmore Children's Fund from the ground up, installing new financial oversight, new board members, new independent audits that made the kind of quiet theft Victoria had gotten away with for 2 years all but impossible going forward. He personally funded the difference of every dollar she'd taken out of his own pocket, refusing to let a single scholarship recipient feel the impact of what had happened. And he had the old cellar door on the west side of the property finally, permanently sealed, not with an iron grate this time, but with concrete poured 3 feet thick, exactly the way his grandfather had always meant to do it and never quite gotten around to. Some doors, he told Sophia, the day the construction crew finished the work, should just stay closed. Sophia stayed at Greystone Manor. She thought about leaving, in the raw weeks right after that night, thought about going home to Ohio, closer to Mateo, closer to her mother, further from a tunnel she still sometimes dreamed about, waking up with her heart pounding and her wrists aching with a pain that wasn't really there anymore. But Mrs. Kim talked her through those weeks with the patient steadiness of someone who had seen hard things before and knew that running from a place wasn't always the same as healing from what happened in it. And Nathaniel, for his part, never once made her feel like staying was an obligation, or like leaving would be some kind of failure. "Whatever you need," he told her, more than once, in the months that followed. "This house is safer now, but it's your decision always. No one is going to make you feel trapped in this house ever again." That word, trapped, sat between them for a long moment the first time he said it, both of them understanding exactly what it meant, exactly what it was reaching back toward and trying, carefully, to repair. Slowly, so slowly that neither of them could have named the exact day it began, something shifted between Nathaniel and Sophia. It wasn't sudden. It wasn't the kind of thing either of them rushed toward, not after everything. It started with him asking about Mateo's nursing program and quietly covering the cost of his final semester's tuition without ever mentioning it to Sophia directly, so that she only found out when her brother called her in tears of disbelief. It started with long conversations in the kitchen after the rest of the house had gone to sleep, conversations that had nothing to do with schedules or work, that were simply two people who had survived something together, learning who the other person really was underneath it. It started, if either of them had to point to a single moment, on a quiet evening nearly a year after that night in the tunnel, when Nathaniel found Sophia sitting alone on the back terrace, looking out over the same gardens where Frank had once warned her to stay away from an old cellar door. "Can I sit?" he asked. "It's your terrace," she said, and there was a smile in her voice now that hadn't been there in a long time. They sat together in comfortable silence for a while, the last light going gold and then soft blue over the hills, and finally Nathaniel spoke, quietly, carefully, the way a man speaks when he has thought about something for a very long time before finally saying it out loud. "I used to think the most important thing in the world was building something that would last," he said. "A company. A legacy. I thought that was the whole measure of a life. It took nearly losing you to understand that none of that means anything if you don't actually see the people standing right in front of you, if you let someone's polish convince you not to notice their character." He looked over at her then, and there was nothing guarded in his face at all. "I see you, Sophia. I've seen you for a long time now. I just didn't let myself say it." She didn't answer right away. She didn't need to. She reached over, the same way she had in that hospital room almost a year before, and closed her hand around his, and this time, it wasn't just two people holding on to the fact that they'd survived something. It was the beginning of something neither of them had been looking for, and both of them, quietly, had needed all along. Sophia still thought about that tunnel sometimes. She probably always would. But she'd learned something in the year, since that terrible night that she carried with her every single day from then on, that the truest measure of a person isn't how they treat the people who can help them get ahead. It's how they treat the people who can't. Victoria had spent 2 years convincing an entire town, an entire social circle, an entire fiancé that she was exactly the kind of woman worth marrying, right up until the one night it truly mattered, when nobody but a quiet maid folding towels was there to see who she really was. And in the end, it hadn't been wealth or polish or a perfectly practiced smile that saved Sophia's life. It had been a man willing to walk quietly through the dark to find out the truth for himself, and a maid brave enough to hold on until he did. If this story moved you even half as much as it moved us while we told it, please take a second to hit that like button. It genuinely helps this story reach more people who need to hear it tonight. If you're new here, consider subscribing because we share stories exactly like this one every single week. And we'd truly love to know, what would you have done if you were Sophia, alone in that tunnel? What would you have done if you were Nathaniel, standing in the dark? Tell us in the comments below. And if this story touched your heart tonight, please share it with someone you love, because stories like Sophia's remind us that real character always shows itself in the end, and that's a message worth passing on. Thank you for watching, and we'll see you in the next story.